Chapter 4. The State House appeared to cover about a square mile of ground, and it was an insane jumble of buildings piled beside and on top of one another, as though it had been in continuous construction ever since the planet was colonized 80-odd years before. At what looked like one of the main entrances, the car stopped. I told our marine driver and auto rifleman to park the car and take in the barbecue, but to leave word with the doorman where they could be found. Hoddy, Thrombley, and I then went in to be met by a couple of New Texas Rangers, one of them the officer who had called to the embassy. They guided us to the office of the Secretary of State. "We're dreadfully late," Thrombley was fretting. "I do hope we haven't kept the Secretary waiting too long." From the looks of him, I was afraid we had. He jumped up from his desk and hurried across the room as soon as the receptionist opened the door for us, his hand extended. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thrombley," he burbled nervously. "And this is the new ambassador, I suppose? And this—" He caught sight of Hoddy Ringo bringing up the rear and stopped short, hand flying to open mouth. "Oh, dear me!" So far I had been building myself a New Texas stereotype from Hoddy Ringo and the ranger officer who had chased us to the embassy, but this frightened little rabbit of a fellow simply didn't fit in. An alien would be justified in assigning him to an entirely different species. Thrombley introduced me. I introduced Hoddy as my confidential secretary and advisor. We all shook hands, and Thrombley dug my credentials out of his briefcase and handed them to me, and I handed them to the Secretary of State, Mr. William A. Palm. He barely glanced at them, then shook my head again fervently and mumbled something about inexpressible pleasure and entirely acceptable to my government. That made me the accredited and accepted ambassador to New Texas. Mr. Palm hoped, or said he hoped, that my stay in New Texas would be long and pleasant. He seemed rather less than convinced that it would be. His eyes kept returning in horrified fascination to my belt. Each time they would focus on the butts of my creptatas, he would pull them resolutely away again. "And now we must take you to President Hutchinson. He is most anxious to meet you, Mr. Silk. If you will please come with me." 4 or 5 rangers who had been loitering the hall outside moved to follow us as we went toward the elevator. Although we had come into the building onto a floor only a few feet above street level, we went down 3 floors from the hallway outside the Secretary of State's office into a huge room, the concrete floor of which was oil-stained as though vehicles were continually being driven in and out. It was about 100 feet wide and 200 or 300 in length. Daylight was visible through open doors at the end. As we approached them, the rangers fanning out on either side and in front of us, I could hear a perfect bedlam of noise outside, shouting, singing, dance band music interspersed with the banging of shots. When we reached the doors at the end, we emerged into one end of a big rectangular plaza, at least 500 yards in length. Most of the uproar was centered at the opposite end, where several thousand people, in costumes colored through the whole spectrum, were milling about. There seemed to be at least 2 square dances going on, to the music of competing bands. At the distant end of the plaza, over the heads of the crowd, I could see the piles and tracks of an overhead crane, towering above what looked like an open hearth furnace. Between us and the bulk of the crowd, in a cleared space, 2 medium tanks, heavily padded with mats, were ramming and trying to overturn each other, the mob of spectators crowding as close to them as they dared. The din was positively deafening, though we were at least 200 yards from the center of the crowd. "Oh, dear, I always dread these things," Palm was saying. "Yes, absolutely anything could happen," Thrombley twittered. "Man, this is a real barbecue," Hoddy gloated. "Now I really feel at home." "Over this way, Mr. Silk," Palm said, guiding me toward the short end of the plaza on our left. "We will see the president, and then—" He gulped. "Then we will all go to the barbecue." In the center of the short end of the plaza, dwarfed by the monster bulks of steel and concrete and glass around it, stood a little old building of warm-tinted adobe. I had never seen it before, but somehow it was familiar looking. And then I remembered. Although I had never seen it before, I had seen it pictured many times, pictured under attack, with gun smoke spouting from windows and parapets. I plucked Thrombley's sleeve. Isn't that a replica of the Alamo?" He was shocked. "Oh, dear, Mr. Ambassador, don't let anybody hear you ask that. That's no replica. It is the Alamo. The Alamo." I stood there a moment looking at it. I was remembering and finally understanding what my psychohistory lessons about the romantic freeze had meant. They had taken this little mission fort down, brick by adobe brick, loaded it carefully into a spaceship, brought it here 42 light years away from Terra, and reverently set it up again. Then they had built a whole world and a whole social philosophy around it. It had been the dissatisfied, of course, the discontented, the dreamers, who had led the vanguard of man's explosion into space following the discovery of the hyperspace drive. They had gone from Terra cherishing dreams of things that had been dumped into the dustbin of history, carrying with them the pictures of ways of life that had passed away, or that had never really been. Then, in their new life, on new planets, they had set to work making those dreams and those pictures live. And many times they had come close to succeeding. These Texans now, they had left behind the cold fact that it had been their state's great industrial complex that had made their migration possible. They ignored the fact that their life here on Capella 4 was possible only by application of modern industrial technology. That rodeo down in the plaza, tank tilting instead of bronco busting. Here they were, living frozen in a romantic dream, a world of roving cowboys and ranch kingdoms. No wonder Hottie hadn't liked the books I'd been reading on the ship. They shook the fabric of that dream. There were people moving about at this relatively quiet end of the plaza, mostly in the direction of the barbecue. 10 or 12 Rangers loitered at the front of the Alamo, and with them I saw the dress blues of my 2 Marines. There was a little 3-wheeled motor cart among them, from which they were helping themselves to food and drink. When they saw us coming, the 2 Marines shoved their sandwiches into the hands of a couple of Rangers and tried to come to attention. At ease, I told them. Have a good time, boys. Hottie, you'd better get in on some of this grub. I may be inside for quite a while." As soon as the Rangers saw Hottie, they hastily got things out of their right hands. Hottie grinned at them. "Take it easy, boys," he said. "I'm protected by the game laws. I'm a diplomat, I am." There were a couple of Rangers lounging outside the door of the president's office, and both of them carried auto rifles, implying things I didn't like. I had seen the president of the Solar League wandering around the domed city of Artemis unattended, looking for all the world like a professor in his academic halls. Since then, maybe before then, I had always had a healthy suspicion of governments whose chiefs had to surround themselves with bodyguards. But the president of New Texas, John Hutchinson, was alone in his office when we were shown in. He got up and came around his desk to greet us, a slender, stoop-shouldered man in a black and gold-laced jacket. He had a narrow, compressed mouth, and eyes that seemed to be watching every corner of the room at once. He wore a pair of small pistols in crossbody holsters under his coat, and he always kept one hand or the other close to his abdomen. He was like, and yet unlike, the Secretary of State. Both had the look of hunted animals, but where Palm was a rabbit, twitching to take flight at the first whiff of danger, Hutchinson was a cat who hears hounds baying, ready to run if he could, or claw if he must. "Good day, Mr. Silk," he said, shaking hands with me after the introductions. "I see you're healed. You're smart. You wouldn't be here today if poor Silas Cumshaw had been as smart as you are. Great man, though, a wise and far-seeing statesman. He and I were real friends." "You know who Mr. Silk brought with him as bodyguard?" Palm asked. "Hottie Ringo." "Oh, my God, I thought this planet was rid of him." The president turned to me. "You got a good trigger man." "Good man to watch your back for you, Mr. Ambassador. But a lot of folks here won't thank you for bringing him back to New Texas." He looked at his watch. "We have time for a little drink before we go outside, Mr. Silk. Care to join me?" I assented, and he got a bottle of super bourbon out of his desk with 4 glasses. Palm got some water tumblers and brought the pitcher of ice water from the cooler. I noticed that the new Texas Secretary of State filled his 3-ounce liquor glass to the top and gulped it down at once. He might act as though he were descended from a long line of maiden aunts, but he took his liquor in blasts that would have floored a spaceport labor boss. We had another drink, a little slower, and chatted for a while, and then Hutchinson said, regretfully, that we'd have to go outside and meet the folks. Outside, our guards, Haughty, the 2 Marines, the Rangers who had escorted us from Palm's office, and Hutchinson's retinue surrounded us, and we made our way down the plaza through the crowd. The din, ear-piercing yells, whistles, cowbells, pistol shots, the cacophony of the 2 dance bands and the chorus singing, of which I caught only the words, "The skies of freedom are above you," was as bad as New Year's Eve in Manhattan or Nairobi or New Moscow on Terra. "Don't take all this as a personal tribute, Mr. Silk," Hutchinson screamed in my ear. "On this planet, to paraphrase Nietzsche, a good barbecue halloweth any cause." That surprised me at the moment. Later I found out that John Hutchinson was one of the leading scholars on New Texas and had once been president of one of their universities, New Texas Christian, I believe. As we got up onto the platform, close enough to the barbecue pits to feel the heat from them, somebody let off what sounded like a 50mm anti-tank gun 5 or 6 times. Hutchinson grabbed a microphone and bellowed into it, "Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please." The noise began to diminish, slowly, until I could hear one voice in the crowd below. "Shut up, you damn fools! We can't eat till this is over." Hutchinson introduced me. In very few words, I gathered that lengthy speeches at barbecues were not popular on New Texas. "Ladies and gentlemen," I yelled into the microphone, "appreciative as I am of this honor, there is one here who is more deserving of your notice than I, one to whom I also pay homage. He's over there on the fire, and I want a slice of him as soon as possible." I got a big ovation. There was, beside the water pitcher, a bottle of super bourbon. I ostentatiously threw the water out of the glass, poured a big shot of the corrosive stuff, and downed it. "For God's sake, let's eat," I finished. Then I turned to Thrombley, who was looking like a priest who has just seen the bishop spit in the holy water font. "Stick close to me," I whispered. "Cue me in on the local notables and the other members of the diplomatic corps." Then we all got down off the platform, and a band climbed up and began playing one of those raucous cowboy ballads which had originated in Manhattan about the middle of the 20th century. "The sandwiches will be here in a moment, Mr. Ambassador," Hutchinson screamed, in effect whispered, in my ear. "Don't feel any reluctance about shaking hands with a sandwich in your other hand. That's standard practice here. You struck just the right note up there. That business with the liquor was positively inspired." The sandwiches, huge masses of meat and hot relish wrapped in tortillas of some sort, arrived, and I bit into one. I'd been eating Super Cow all my life, frozen or electron beam for transportation, and now I was discovering that I had never really eaten Super Cow before. I finished the first sandwich in surprisingly short order and was starting on my second when the crowd began coming. First, the diplomatic corps, the usual collection of weirdies, human and otherwise. There was the ambassador from Tara in a suit of what his planet produced as a substitute for Irish homespuns. His embassy, if it was like the others I had seen elsewhere, would be an outsized cottage with whitewashed walls and a thatched roof, with a bowl of milk outside the door for the little people. The ambassador from Alpharats, too, the South African nationalist planet, with a full beard, and old-fashioned plug hat and tailcoat. They were a frustrated lot. They had gone into space to practice apartheid, and had settled on a planet where there was no other intelligent race to be superior to. The Mormon ambassador from Desiree, Delta Camelopardalis 5, the ambassador from Spica 7, a short, jolly-looking little fellow with a head like a seal's, long arms, short legs, and a tail like a kangaroo's. The ambassador from Beta Cephas 6, who could have passed for human if he hadn't had blood with a copper base instead of iron. His skin was a dark green and his hair was a bright blue. I was beginning to correct my first impression that Thrombly was a complete dithering fool. He stood at my left elbow, whispering the names and governments and home planets of the ambassadors as they came up, handed me little slips of paper on which he had written phonetically correct renditions of the greetings I would give them in their own language. I was still twittering a reply to the greeting of Nunabadian from Beta Cephas 6 when he whispered to me, "Here it comes, sir. The Zisroff." The Zisroff were reasonably close to human stature and appearance, allowing for the fact that their ancestry had been canine instead of simian. They had, of course, longer and narrower jaws than we have, and definitely carnivorous teeth. There were stories floating around that they enjoyed barbecued terran even better than they did super cow and hot relish. This one advanced, extending his 3-fingered hand. "I am most happy to make connection with Solar League representative," he said. "I am named Glafar Despetian Vuvuvu." No wonder Thrombly let him introduce himself. I answered in the basic English that was all he'd admit to understanding. "The name of your great nation has gone before you to me. The stories we tell to our young of you are at the top of our books. I have hope to make great pleasure in you and me to be friends." Glafar Vuvuvu's smile wavered a little at the oblique reference to the couple of trouncings our space navy had administered to Zisroff ships in the past. "We will be in the same place again, times with no number," the alien replied. "I have hope for you that time you are in this place will be long and will put pleasure in your heart." Then the pleasure of the line behind him pushed him on. Cabinet members, senators and representatives, prominent citizens, mostly Judge so-and-so or Colonel this or that. It was all a blur, so much so that it was an instant before I recognized the gleaming golden hair and the statuesque figure. "Thank you. I have met the ambassador." The lovely voice was shaking with restrained anger. "Gale!" I exclaimed. "Your father coming to the barbecue, Gale?" President Hutchinson was asking. "He ought to be here any minute. He sent me on ahead from the hotel. He wants to meet the ambassador. That's why I joined the line." "Well, suppose I leave Mr. Silk in your hands for a while," Hutchinson said. "I ought to circulate around a little." "Yes, just leave him in my hands," she said vindictively. "What's wrong, Gale? I wanted to know. I know I was supposed to meet you at the spaceport, but you made a beautiful fool of me at the spaceport. Look, I can explain everything. My embassy staff insisted on hurrying me off. Somebody gave a high-pitched whoop directly behind me and emptied the clip of a pistol. I couldn't even hear what else I said. I couldn't hear what she said either, but it was something angry. "You have to listen to me," I roared in her ear. "I can explain everything." "Any diplomat can explain anything," she shouted back. "Look, Gale, you're hanging an innocent man," I yelled back at her. "I'm entitled to a fair trial." Somebody on the platform began firing his pistol within inches of the loudspeakers, and it sounded like an H-bomb going off. She grabbed my wrist and dragged me toward a door under the platform. "Down here," she yelled, "and this better be good, Mr. Silk." We went down a spiral ramp lighted by widely scattered overhead lights. "Space attack shelter," she explained. "And look, what goes on in spaceships is one thing, but it's as much as a girl's reputation is worth to come down here during a barbecue." There seemed to be quite a few girls at that barbecue who didn't care what happened to their reputations. We discovered that after looking into a couple of passageways that branched off the entrance. "Over this way," Gale said. "Confederate Courts building. There won't be anything going on over here now." I told her with as much humorous detail as possible about how Thrombly had shanghaied me to the embassy and about the chase by the Rangers. Before I was half through, she was laughing heartily, all traces of her anger gone. Finally, we came to a stairway, and at the head of it, a small door. "It's been 4 years that I've been away from here," she said. "I think there's a reading room at the law library up here. Let's go in and enjoy the quiet for a while." But when we opened the door, there was a ranger standing inside. "Come to see a trial, Mr. Silk?" "Oh, hello, Gale. Just in time. They're going to prepare for the next trial." As he spoke, something clicked at the door. Gail looked at me in consternation. "Now we're locked in," she said. "We can't get out till the trial's over." End of chapter 4.